Hello. Hi, I'm David, and this is an event by Platypus SAIC on the New Deal on the left. Teach-in by Ed Remus, one of our members in Platypus. Platypus is an organization, student organization that hosts weekly reading groups, public fora, including panel events, and our monthly open submission journal, the Platypus Review, and weekly coffee breaks. Our reading group is Mondays from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. in this building in room 1216 upstairs, and I encourage you guys to come if you're not coming already. And our coffee breaks are every Wednesday from 4:30 to 5:30 at the corner bakery just across the way right there. And I also encourage you guys to come for that as well. Do you want to read off the description, or you don't have it in front of you? Well, I'm going to hand over the mic to Ed, and he can introduce the event.
All right, welcome everyone. Can you hear me okay? Volume a little higher? Okay. I'll probably gradually move the mic farther from my mouth over. Is there a mic stand? Oh, that would be great. If there's like a table stand. Oh, that's all right. I'll hold it. Can you hear me all right now? Is this okay? Okay. So I'll just make a few introductory points. One is that my intended co-presenter this evening, Marco Torres, unfortunately couldn't be with us. He's not feeling well. And he was going to address a few different topics in relation to the New Deal. He was going to speak about the millennial left's late Obama term and Trump-era politics around the Green New Deal. He was going to address ways in which the Stalinization of the left in the 20s impacted the way in which the old left of the 1930s related to the politics of the New Deal. He was going to talk a little bit about the Frankfurt School and its approach to the transformations of the state in the 1930s, including the New Deal. So I'm going to try to touch on those a little bit, but I'm hoping we have members here in the audience who are pretty familiar with those topics as well. So I hope that they can come up despite Marco's absence. A second point, I guess, is that this is sort of experimental in what I'm about to present. There are certain points on which I'm fairly confident, and I think others are a little bit more speculative or kind of incompletely drawn. So hopefully we can kind of return to those in the Q&A. I guess thirdly, just in terms of format, I have about 10 single-space pages here. It's kind of a lot. It's conversational in tone, but it's a lot. I'm going to be talking at you a lot. So truly, raise your hand if you have a question or if you want to jump in at any point here. We can kind of talk a bit, and then I'll pick up the plot again. So without further ado, the American left today is a political and societal adjunct of the Democratic Party. And therefore, the ideas we receive from today's academic and activist left are the ideas that the Democratic Party uses to understand itself and its own history. The existing left's historical consciousness is effectively the historical consciousness of the Democratic Party. And if history refers to how the present relates to the past, then history, for today's left, tends to mean relating to some moment in the history of the Democratic Party and holding it up as a potentially usable past. The memory of the New Deal served as an enduring fixture within the historical imagination of sections of the Democratic Party throughout the neoliberal era. Among Democratic Party-affiliated liberals, progressives, and leftists of various stripes, the prospects of expanding the reach of the state through a New Deal was floated during the Carter presidency in hopes of combating economic recession and restoring national purpose, during the Clinton presidency in hopes of rolling back Reaganite attacks on social welfare spending and on the labor movement, and closest to our own historical moment, during the early years of the Obama presidency, when there arose hopes of rebuilding the national economy amidst the wreckage of the 2007-2008 real estate and financial crisis. The young can be forgiven for failing to recognize that something apparently new is actually quite old. Almost exactly 10 years ago, when I first encountered the call for a New Deal, it did not sound to me like the regurgitation reflex of a Democratic Party politics that could neither fully swallow the legacy of the New Deal nor properly spit it out. It sounded to me rather like a bold proposal for national political and economic renewal. It sounded like a political vision that I could advocate for ideologically as a young academicized leftist, and one that I could hope to effect practically as a young professional joining the entry-level ranks of the urban social services sector. Previously, in the context of the anti-Iraq war movement on the left during the second Bush term, I had been seriously contemplating spending my life in agrarian intentional communities of the Catholic worker variety in the interest of fulfilling a moral and political obligation to contribute as little of my taxable income as possible to the military-industrial complex. By late 2008, I had decided that this 1970s vintage rural anarchism could not hope to transform American politics. So during Obama's first term, a few years before joining Platypus, I went shopping around among left organizations in search of an urban Marxism. I encountered two avowedly revolutionary Marxist and Leninist organizations founded during the 1960s to 70s New Left period, whose historical imaginations were fundamentally conditioned by the 1930s Old Left period. The Stalinist League of Revolutionaries for a New America and the Trotskyist International Socialist Organization. Each organization related to the history of the New Deal in ways that remain with us today on the left and are worth considering in turn. For the Stalinist LRNA, the 1930s was a period during which American fascists were working hard to organize American society for right-wing counter-revolution, inspired by the Nazi example and supported by business interests such as the small business-dominated National Association of Manufacturers that felt themselves threatened by FDR's moderate capitalist reform agenda. The task of the left in that historical context, Lerna argued, was to organize social forces, the labor movement, the intelligentsia, the poor, and the unorganized, in support of the progressive side of the internecine capitalist class conflict, namely finance capital and the largest firms, the most capital-intensive firms, as represented by FDR's New Deal electoral coalition. Lerna analogized this Depression-era landscape to that of the post-2008 Great Recession, during which right-wing small business and suburban Tea Party activists and sections of the Republican Party establishment opposed Obama's finance capitalist reform agenda and threatened a far-right and fascistic takeover of American politics. The task of the millennial left, they argued, was therefore to fight the right by organizing today's social forces, educated progressives, labor remnants, the urban poor, behind the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and in support of electoral organizations such as the Progressive Democrats of America. In safe states where the far right posed little threat, third-party formations like the 2012 Justice Party could, to Lerna, likewise serve for revolutionary Marxists as recruiting grounds ripe with progressives seeking to push the Democratic Party to the left. By these means, American Marxists could hope to beat back the right-wing onslaught and recruit progressives from electoral work into revolutionary sectarian organizations, like Lerna. When confronted with the fact that the Communist Party's Popular Front-era pursuit of a very similar strategy rendered it indistinguishable from progressive liberalism, ideologically and politically, and helpless in the face of the Democratic Party's post-World War II McCarthyite purge of American labor, government, and culture, Lerna's leader, Nelson Peary, chalked their fate up to a tactical rather than strategic error. The CP of the 30s ought to have maintained greater ideological militancy and organizational autonomy. Now, to the ISO's ears, to the ears of the International Socialist Organization, Trotskyist, this entire perspective smacked of Stalinism. The ISO characterized the Democratic Party as the graveyard of social movements and characterized the Popular Front strategy of the 1930s CP as leading the labor movement into this graveyard. Alternatively, the ISO characterized the post-1930s coalition between organized labor and the Democratic Party as a barren marriage in which the former partner alternatively manipulated or neglected the latter partner throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The Stalinized CP, to the ISO, made the mistake of liquidating the party political independence of the labor movement into electoral support for the Roosevelt New Deal coalition. If the problem of the 1930s CP then, according to the ISO, was one of a liquidating electoralism, Their answer, the model to be taken from the 1930s, was one of a militant movementism. It was during the 1930s, after all, that American Trotskyists led historic labor strikes and participated in a wider CP-dominated climate of labor militancy that generated an enormous pressure from below, or subterranean fire, to quote an ISO-published book title. Then, as now, by organizing and directing this pressure from below within the labor movement, and now within other social and protest movements today, American Marxists could hope to lead the fight for a better deal, both on the shop floor vis-a-vis labor contracts with individual capitalist firms and sectors, as well as vis-a-vis the social welfare benefits that can be wrested from the capitalist state. By these means, American Marxists could hope to win a reputation as the most militant organizers in contemporary activist campaigns, and thereby recruit other workers and activists into revolutionary sectarian organizations like the ISO. When confronted with the question of whether, when, and how this strategy would lead to the formation of a revolutionary socialist party that would operate, among other realms, in the electoral realm, in the properly political sense, it was argued that the conditions for such a party were not ripe and would not be ripe for the foreseeable future. These two sketches of the Stalinist Lerna and the Trotskyist ISO are written largely from my memory of how these issues appeared to me at the time, a decade ago, as a young leftist being courted for membership by each organization. At the time, what seemed most important to me was the issue of Stalinism versus Trotskyism. And in the course of identifying with the latter at the level at least of historical perspective, if not at the level of practical politics, I drew closer to Platypus and became a member in 2010. But what strikes me now, on the other side of an education in Platypus, are 3 points of fundamental similarity between these Stalinist and Trotskyist perspectives. The first point in common is that they each identify the 1930s as the high watermark of American socialism. The second is that they each draw upon the 1930s to justify a sectarian organizational model for revolutionary Marxists, whether that model calls for the simultaneous participation in electoral campaigns dominated by progressive liberals, or whether that model calls for the simultaneous participation in social movement activist campaigns dominated by progressive liberals. The third point in common, which I've come to learn more recently, is that they each draw upon a specific historical interpretation of the Socialist Party of America led by Eugene Debs prior to 1919, that of a book titled The American Socialist Movement by Ira Kipnis, which was first published in 1952 and is now republished by the ISO's Haymarket Books. Kipnis was a Stalinist, a member of the Stalinized Communist Party, and his history presents Bill Haywood's industrial syndicalist faction as the sole manifestation of a genuinely revolutionary politics within a party that was otherwise compromised fundamentally by reformist leadership. This perspective on the SPA is used to justify the argument that the year 1919 marks not the crisis and death, but instead the beginning and birth of a genuinely revolutionary Marxian socialism in the United States, and is similarly used to present the 1930s as the full flowering of an industrial unionism that was held back during the 1910s by SPA misleadership. Having addressed the place of the New Deal in the historic imagination of two representative organizations on the activist side of the American left, it's worth considering how this history appears to the academic side of the American left, how students on the left today might encounter this history, the history of the New Deal, from academic leftists and professors who are assigning historical texts. Just as the activist left has functioned since the old left of the 1930s as an organizational adjunct of the Democratic Party, so too has the academic left functioned since the mid-20th century as an intellectual adjunct of the Democratic Party. To understand the relevance of this fact to the academic historiography inherited by today's student left, we have to consider two broad political phases of the Democratic Party: the 1930s to 60s New Deal coalition of organized labor, urban ethnic political machines, and Southern Dixiecrats, which administered a national and global Keynesian Fordist regime of capital accumulation during the mid-20th century. And then the post-1970s McGovernite coalition, first sort of coalescing in the 1972 U.S. presidential election, of educated professionals, organized minority groups, and remnants of organized labor and of the welfare state, which administered a national and global neoliberal regime of accumulation from the 1970s down into the recent period. The first reflects the 1930s to 40s integration of the labor movement into the Democratic Party, and the second reflects the 1960s to 80s integration of the social movements into the Democratic Party. In the wake of this latter McGovernite turn, the New Deal increasingly came to mean, quote, when affirmative action was white, to mean, quote, dividing citizens by gender, and to mean, quote, the straight state. Those are the titles of 3 academic books about exclusionary dimensions of the New Deal, published by liberal historians during the neoliberal era between the late 1990s and early 2010s. By this period, the New Deal had come to mean the politics of class, so to speak, running roughshod over the politics of race, gender, and sexuality. And therefore, the New Deal had come to represent a political past no longer usable for Democrats facing the neoliberal era. Today, even the Democrats remaining class experts, playing on the notion of race experts, can be found arrayed against any attempted revival of the New Deal, unlike the labor historians who functioned as the academic class experts of previous generations. An influential 2016 book by the contemporary cultural historian Jefferson Cowie characterizes the New Deal as a great exception that leftists today neither could nor should realistically hope to repeat. The historian's characterization of New Deal policy outcomes as racist, sexist, heterosexist, and classist, even that last may be meaning workers getting a raw deal, are good as far as they go. In the face of this neoliberal historiographical consensus, a left perspective could appear to be one which favors a revived New Deal purged of exclusionary or discriminatory policy outcomes, a kind of neoliberal redux of the paleoliberal New Deal project. This is indeed the imagination of sections of the left today. And Marco at this point was going to talk a little bit about how the left has imagined the New Deal and organized around a politics of a Green New Deal, particularly in the second Obama term, given the rise of the DSA, and now also under Trump. I think that we're probably broadly familiar with some of the contours of that, but maybe we can talk a little bit more in the discussion. So in the face of this contemporary moment of a kind of New Dealism or Green New Dealism on the left, 4 broad historical points are worth making. The first is that the high watermark of the American left is not to be found during the 1930s, in the progressive capitalist politics of the New Deal coalition, or in the avowedly revolutionary politics of the Communist and Trotskyist organizations of the Third and Fourth Internationals, who organized variously within and around that coalition. Rather, the high water mark of the American and international left is to be found during the 1900s and 1910s in the Marxist-led parties of the Second International, including the Debsian revolutionary Debs-led Socialist Party of America, or SPA. I'll refer to it from that as now on. The second point is that a dissident populist liberal tradition of American historiography and political sociology can be drawn upon to trace the politically conservative and counter-revolutionary character of the progressive politics which opposed and ultimately eclipsed the SPA. This tradition further traces some political through lines leading from progressivism to the New Deal. The third point, which Marco is going to elaborate, so maybe we can come around to it, is that the counter-revolutionary Stalinization of the international and American left that began during the 1920s fundamentally circumscribed the political horizons open to the American left during the 1930s. In the absence of any genuinely revolutionary leftist agency vis-a-vis capitalism, the transformations of capitalism and of the capitalist state that took place during the period of the New Deal are really rendered the objects of social theoretical study rather than of political subjectivity. The fourth point is that during the 1930s, both Trotsky and the Frankfurt School maintained a perspective on the New Deal consistent with the radicalism, the Marxist radicalism of the Second International. Their perspective can be considered dialectical in relation to liberal and Stalinist populism, to which progressivism and New Deal statism appear as purely counter-revolutionary, as well as in relation to liberal and Stalinist progressivism, to which progressive and New Deal statism appear as essentially revolutionary or leading towards revolution. This helps to clarify the way in which the unprecedented centralization of political economic governing power appeared to Lenin as a potential asset for a future dictatorship of the proletariat. So now turning a bit to the first point on the SPA. The SPA, and I want to present a bit of a general background for those who may be unfamiliar, was founded in 1901 by American Marxists Eugene Debs, Morris Hillquit, and Victor Berger. Like other revolutionary socialist political parties of the Second International, they took as their model the Social Democratic Party of Germany, led by the German Marxist theoretician Karl Kautsky. The SPA existed in its Debsian or Kautskian form as a mass multi-tendency and multi-strategy political party for revolutionary socialism in the United States from its founding in 1901 until its crisis in 1919. At its height, it claimed over 120,000 members, over 500 publications, nearly 1 million subscribers around 1912 to its major daily out of Kansas, The Appeal to Reason, and hundreds of thousands more subscribers to other major party publications like the Jewish Daily Forward out of New York. Over 1,000 elected officials across the United States. I believe that number approached something like 1,300 or 1,400 at one point, including sheriffs, mayors, aldermen, and 2 members of U.S. Congress. The political support of at times a near majority of members of the American Federation of Labor, comprised of trade and craft unions, and a majority of members of the Industrial Workers of the World, which was co-founded by party leaders including Bill Haywood and Debs, which was comprised of nascent industrial unions. A wide network of cultural and civil social organizations, including singing clubs, religious organizations, Southwestern U.S. revivalist encampments, Sunday schools, urban temperance groups, ethnic drinking clubs, urban gymnasia, an intercollegiate student organization, a technical school. There was even a millionaire socialist club. And of course, they had formidable political machines in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which formed the power bases of party leaders Berger and Hillquit. Debs, meanwhile, served as the party's most famous standard bearer and its 5-time presidential candidate, variously earning between 3 and 6% of the national vote in elections between 1900 and 1920. Now, much more could be said about the history and significance of the SPA. It's the subject of multiple books and could be the subject of many talks. But for the purposes of considering the New Deal from the political perspective of the historic left, it is worth considering what the SPA stood for during the years before 1919 and how the SPA related to the capitalist politics of its day. Broadly speaking, one can say that the SPA struggled for proletarian socialism against petit bourgeois populism, as well as against haute bourgeois progressivism, and that it did so under the banner of a political party completely independent from and opposed to all capitalist parties of its day, the Democratic Party no less than the Republican Party. And those might seem like obvious points, but I mention them to kind of set up a contrast to that which comes later during the 1930s on the American left. 3 distinct political tendencies emerged during the period from the late 1890s through the pivotal election of 1912: populism, progressivism, and socialism. These tendencies can be differentiated with respect to their approaches to 3 major issues of the day: the trusts, organized labor, and imperialism. Populism expressed above all the interests of small farmers, small businesses, and some urban ethnic immigrant constituencies. It sought to break up the trusts into smaller firms to avoid the need for organized labor, or, if necessary, to integrate organized labor as a junior partner in capitalist production, and to oppose U.S. imperialism on the grounds that it served the interests of the trusts over the interests of the smaller competing firms. Progressivism expressed the interests of the capitalist trusts, of professional middle-class reformers allied to them, and of reformist labor leaders. It sought to regulate the trusts at a federal level, which the trusts themselves actually desired, to integrate organized labor as a junior partner in capitalist production, and to pursue the interests of the trusts at a global level via imperialism if necessary. Socialism expressed the interest of the organized working class in controlling the means of production. It sought to socialize the trusts in the dictatorship of the proletariat, or cooperative commonwealth. to organize labor for eventual social democratic control of the trusts, and to oppose capitalist militarism and imperialist war in favor of an international government of proletarian socialist political parties then rising in power across the world. The central conflict facing these rising socialist political parties concerned their relation to progressivism. In Germany, and here I'm sort of telescoping and condensing much of what is covered in the Platypus primary reading group for those who might not be familiar. In Germany, where the Socialist Party grew to become the single largest political and social force during the years of the Progressive era, an approach to organized labor and to militarism that was effectively progressivist in nature took hold within the Socialist Party base itself as a function really of its expansion and success. Although repudiated theoretically by party leaders, its political victory was expressed by initially actually by a mid-1900s secret pact between the labor leaders and the party that would guarantee the political a degree of political autonomy of the labor movement, but especially and conclusively by the party's 1914 support for the war effort of the capitalist German government. And then equally, perhaps conclusively, if not more conclusively, the political victory of progressivism within the German Socialist Party was expressed by its armed suppression of the 1918-19 proletarian revolution. This series of events bequeathed what Platypus member Richard Rubin has characterized as the German problem to the history of socialism. Created as an instrument of revolution, the party became an instrument of counter-revolution, in this case in the context of rising global progressivism that was expressed in and through the party itself. In Russia, meanwhile, an approach to organized labor that was effectively progressivist in nature took shape also under the banner of the Socialist Party there. But Lenin therefore split the Socialist Party in 1903, and on the basis of this split was ultimately able to lead the party to proletarian governing power in 1917. The Russian Socialist Party, led by Lenin, found its prospects for socialist transformation in 1917-19 blocked, however, in light of the German problem. The revolution didn't spread. It was stopped and turned back in Germany. The Russian Party, therefore, degenerated into an instrument of counter-revolution in the historically novel form of Stalinism, bequeathing what Richard Rubin termed the Russian problem to the history of socialism. The American problem, right, if we have kind of the German problem and the Russian problem of these political parties for socialism in the context of the progressive era, the American problem could be described as the failure to fully construct the instrument, the party, in the first place. In America, the party never organized enough of American politics and society to see the forces of progressivism, then rising globally, bid for power in a decisive manner within its own ranks. Even though there were tensions around these areas. During the war years, it was the pro-war socialists, the pro-war socialists, Upton Sinclair, Walter Lippmann, A.M. Simons, William English Walling, who bolted the anti-war Socialist Party of America for progressivism, rather than the other way around, as in Germany. Daniel Bell, writing an autopsy of the SPA from the vantage point of Cold War social democracy, argued that the SPA could have evolved into a junior partner in capitalist government on the model of the revisionist European social democratic parties, if only it had supported the First World War. On the question of whether the party would seek to lead the labor movement in socializing the trusts, or rather in becoming a junior partner within capitalist regulation of them, even Victor Berger, who built a municipal socialist electoral machine on craft and trade union support, and probably did least among party leaders to organize the unorganized, never wavered from the goal of collective ownership of the trusts. The party's growth was threatening enough to provoke the counter-revolutionary First Red Scare under Woodrow Wilson following the First World War, during which the party's mail was grounded, its organizers hounded, and in some cases violently persecuted, and its leader, Eugene Debs, jailed. The second and truly fatal blow to the party came not from without but from within. During his brief time in New York in 1917, Trotsky convinced American socialists, such as Louis Freina, that if the domino theory of socialist revolution proved correct, and the revolution in Russia went on to spark revolutions in Germany, France, Britain, and America, then sections of the SPA would end up playing a counter-revolutionary role similar to that of the SPD in Germany. It was necessary, therefore, to split the SPA in anticipation of this. Now, perhaps had the post-war revolutionary wave spread farther than it actually did, a party on the Bolshevik model would indeed have been necessary to effect revolutionary politics in the United States, as Trotsky thought. The problem was that the 1917-19 revolution was defeated in Germany and could defend its conquest of state power only in Russia. This meant that revolutionary socialist politics in America entered the 1920s split into three organizations, which even taken together did not sort of in size or in power approximate the pre-war SPA in a meaningful way. One was the Rump SPA, still led by Berger, Hillquit, and Debs, crippled by the terror, opposing U.S. hostility towards the Soviet Union, but refusing to take orders from Zinoviev and the Soviet-led Third International, which incidentally, Rosa Luxemburg had her doubts about founding towards the end of her life, and then two Third International parties, which soon fused to form the Communist Party USA. The death of the American and international left can effectively be dated to the year 1919. And at this point, or in the context of this talk, Marco is going to describe again the Stalinization of the international and American left, and how that limited the ability of the American left to escape the fatal gravitational orbit of progressive capitalist politics, the New Deal coalition during the 1930s. The preceding synopsis of the rise and fall of the Socialist Party of America is useful, however, if only to underscore the point that the high water mark of the American left was not reached during the period of the New Deal, as is widely believed both within and beyond the American left. The Debsian SPA was larger, stronger, better organized, and most importantly, more potentially revolutionary than the American left has been at any moment since. It stood entirely independent of and opposed to, in direct competition with, the political parties of progressive capitalism that shaped its era. Only if one fully appreciates this can one fully appreciate the simultaneously conservative and progressive, revolutionary and counter-revolutionary nature of such interrelated phenomena as the triumph of progressivism, the First World War, and the New Deal. What then is the history of the New Deal itself? Now, we in Platypus focus on the history of the left. The history of American progressivism, culminating in the New Deal, by contrast, is the history of those seeking not to overcome capitalism, as was the historic horizon of the left, but to preserve it by transforming it. Leftist historiography of the New Deal tends to do as much to obscure this point as to clarify it, especially insofar as it effectively fuses with the progressivist perspective on this history. Some of the most provocative insights into this political history can therefore be found within a few discordant traditions of American thought that fall outside of avowed Marxism. Hailing, for example, from the Wisconsin School of Historiography, the historian Gabriel Kolko treats Marx as an economic theorist only, neglecting his political thought. The paleo-liberal libertarian economist Murray Rothbard treats Marx as a statist, akin to the progressives. And there's a political sociologist hailing from a kind of C. Wright Mills school named William Domhoff, who effectively associates Marx with an economically reductionist theory of the state. So in mentioning these three thinkers, I should say that they take the Marxism of their leftist contemporaries to reflect the genuine article, which I think we in Platypus would dispute. However, they articulate a broadly populist liberal approach to the progressive era, to the First World War, and to the New Deal. And I think that some of these texts taken together can help to clarify the counter-revolutionary nature of the progressive era as it evolved into the First World War and eventually the New Deal. Now here I have a few notes, and I'm not going to read verbatim, But I want to sort of summarize some of the insights that come from this book, The Triumph of Conservatism, by Gabriel Coco, the historian out of the Wisconsin School. And I suppose what's remarkable about it is that, again, coming from a kind of broadly, I suppose you could say, populist liberal perspective, it characterizes the progressive era as conservative and counter-revolutionary, full stop. And it articulates this kind of these three approaches to the trusts, as I've talked about previously. The way in which the populist, the leading populist of the day, William Jennings Bryan, who ran for an independent presidential candidacy in 1896, and then later in the 1900s, I believe 1908, the Democratic Party presidential candidate, he effectively reflected this perspective that wanted to break up the trusts, right? That wanted to kind of rejuvenate conditions, revive conditions for small farmers, small businesses, kind of back to laissez-faire, right? This was a perspective that, unlike the progressivists who were interventionist in matters of urban vice as well, for example, they were prohibitionists, the populism of this period was laissez-faire, both regard to kind of personal liberty, but also wanting to kind of turn the clock back to a situation more amenable to small capitalist competition. Now, during this period, Roosevelt, of course, famously wanted instead to regulate the trusts. And I'm not going to go in depth into Kolko's argument, except to say that I think if you read him, what you'll be impressed by is the extent to which the trusts themselves desired this regulation. So Teddy Roosevelt presents himself to the public as this great foe of the trusts, right? And talks about a square deal where the state will kind of neither intervene on behalf of organized labor nor on behalf of the trusts, and he seems to sort of threaten them in a certain way. But actually many of the trusts of the era, such as in railroads and meat, actually desired a greater degree of federal regulation, of standardization. And so much of what happens during TR's presidency is the implementation of this. And there's a political logic here that you also see during the New Deal, which is in the face of cutthroat competition, it's often the larger firms that actually are more amenable to the government taking certain actions that kind of raise the general overhead in a given sector, because by taking regulatory actions that have that effect, it actually makes it more difficult for cutthroat competitors and small businesses to enter the market. So this is one of the reasons why the kind of William Jennings Bryan populism that's at this period associated with the Democratic Party is actually opposed to this move of federal government regulation, whereas the progressives and Teddy Roosevelt are for it. Now, the 1908 election of William Howard Taft in the Republican Party on Kolko's account effectively disrupts this, because Kolko it's almost reminiscent, reading Kolko, of the way Trump today characterizes certain politicians as simply ineffectual, as kind of doing a bad job, right? This was essentially TR's characterization of Taft, that he was kind of botching it in the sense that he was not giving the trusts a sufficient degree of stability. He was sometimes initiating antitrust federal legal action against them more than the supposedly trust busting TR had done. And he also broke from a system that TR had put in place, which was called détente, where basically there would be a kind of informal working out between the federal government, sometimes TR himself, if necessary, and the trusts to kind of smooth out issues, maybe antitrust concerns, so that federal legal action would not have to be brought against the trusts. Taft effectively disrupted this. And so this was really the context for the progressive electoral bid for presidency of TR in 1912 that led to the four-way election between in which Eugene Debs was also a candidate. And it's also then the context in which Wilson wins the presidency on the Democratic Party nomination. Now, Wilson, recall that at this time the Democratic Party is still the party of populism. But Wilson's candidacy, as opposed to that of William Jennings Bryan in the previous election, effectively represents the opening for progressivism within the Democratic Party. Wilson is much more amenable to this perspective than Bryan of regulating the trusts and kind of integrating the progressive movement for a more regulated capitalism into the Democratic Party. Now, this is also the period during which this politics is supported by a vast array of middle-class social workers, reformers, by the settlement house movement as reflected by Jane Addams, and a lot of intellectuals whose approach to political economy is not that of proletarian socialism, namely seeking the dictatorship of the proletariat, in the way that Lenin, Kautsky, Trotsky, Luxemburg, Debs, and also even Hillquit and Berger in their own way had supported, but rather they seek a kind of more regulated state, and a kind of stronger state, and they particularly see an opportunity for this in the war. And this is where I think Rothbard is very interesting. Because I think we can typically see the First World War as counter-revolutionary, with respect to the kind of mass slaughter of the working class, right? And perhaps more pointedly with respect to a curbing of a way of heading off the growth of the Social Democratic Party in Germany. And I think indeed it can be considered counter-revolutionary in these respects. But for Rothbard, kind of hailing from this populist dimension of American historiography, it's also counter-revolutionary in the sense that it provides an opportunity for these anti-socialist progressives to realize their state regulatory aims in a way that was not politically possible prior to the First World War. So I want to just read a few selective passages that I think that I think make this point. Rothbard argues, more than any other single period, World War I was the critical watershed for the American business system. It was a war collectivism, a totally planned economy run largely by big business interests through the instrumentality of the central government, which served as the model, the precedent, and the inspiration for state corporate capitalism for the remainder of the 20th century. That inspiration and precedent emerged not only in the United States, but also in the war economies of the major combatants of World War I. War collectivism showed the big business interests of the Western world that it was possible to shift radically from the previous largely free market capitalism to a new order marked by strong government and extensive and pervasive government intervention and planning, and for the purpose of providing a network of subsidies and monopolistic privileges to business, and especially to large business interests. In particular, the economy could be cartelized under the aegis of government, with prices raised and production fixed and restricted, in the classical pattern of monopoly. And military and other government contracts could be channeled into the hands of favored corporate producers. Labor, which had been becoming increasingly rambunctious, could be tamed and bridled into the service of this new state monopoly capitalist order through the device of promoting a suitably cooperative trade unionism and by bringing the willing union leaders into the planning system as junior partners. And it should be noted that Samuel Gompers, in the United States context, effectively supported this kind of labor integration into the state as represented by the National Civic Federation, I believe. And Lenin wrote about this at the time in commenting on the politics of the American labor movement. Jumping ahead a bit, Rothbard notes also, historians have generally treated the economic planning of World War I as an isolated episode dictated by the requirements of the day and having little further significance. But on the contrary, the war collectivism served as an inspiration and as a model for a mighty army of forces destined to forge the history of 20th century America. For big business, the wartime economy was a model of what could be achieved in national coordination and cartelization, as has been mentioned, in stabilizing production, prices, and profits, in replacing the old-fashioned competitive laissez-faire by a system that they could broadly control and that would harmonize the claims of various powerful economic groups. It was a system that had already abolished much competitive diversity in the name of standardization. The wartime economy especially galvanized business leaders who would promote the cooperative association of business and trade groups an association that paved the way for the cooperative statism of FDR's Agricultural Adjustment Agency and National Recovery Act. The wartime collectivism also held forth a model to the nation's liberal intellectuals, for here was a seemingly a system that replaced laissez-faire not by the rigors and class hatreds of proletarian Marxism, but by a new strong state, planning and organizing the economy in harmony with all leading economic groups. It was, not coincidentally, to be a neo-mercantilism, a mixed economy, heavily staffed by these self-same liberal intellectuals. And finally, for both big business and liberals, they saw in the wartime model a way to organize and integrate the often unruly labor force as a junior partner, as had been mentioned, to be disciplined by their own responsible leadership of the labor unions. Now, finally, I'm not going to read much more at length, but in thinking about the New Deal, I think there was an original sense that I'll get to in a moment, in which the New Deal sort of morphs into the War Deal of the Second World War. But I think what Rothbard sort of interestingly points out, and he traces the continuity of, I'll just give you a bit of it here, at the level of personages and organizations, is that basically the wartime planning apparatus that was unprecedented and novel in the First World War is effectively revived, redeployed in the context of the New Deal. So Rothbard writes, not merely the NRA and AAA, but virtually the entire New Deal apparatus, including the bringing to Washington of a host of liberal intellectuals and planners, owed its inspiration to the war collectivism of World War I. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, founded by Hoover in 1932 and expanded by Roosevelt's New Deal, was a revival and expansion of the old War Finance Corporation, which had loaned government funds to munitions firms. Furthermore, Hoover, after offering the post to Bernard Baruch, named as first chairman of the RFC Eugene Mayer, who had been managing director of the WFC. Much of the old World War I WFC staff and method of operations were taken over bodily by the new agency. The Tennessee Valley Authority grew out of a wartime government nitrate and electric power project at Muscle Shoals, and in fact included the old nitrate plant as one of its first assets. Many of the public power advocates in the New Deal had been trained in such wartime agencies as the power section of the Emergency Fleet Corporation. And even the innovative government corporate form of the TVA was based on wartime precedent. And he goes on to describe this in additional New Deal agencies, the way that this was playing out. So I guess it's just worth thinking about that when FDR takes office, he basically argues that and announces to the American public that he's going to seek and require to stabilize the situation the kind of powers that would otherwise only be given to an executive authority in a time of war. And this can seem like kind of a generic statement about war, but here it had a very specific meaning. It was actually drawing directly upon the transformation of the American and indeed global capitalist state during the First World War. Now, there's maybe another set of points that could be made with respect to the 1920s, and I don't really want to focus on that too much. But I think one point bearing in mind that emerges from some of the liberal historiography is that the 1920s were a period not only of a kind of beginning dissolution of the proletarian civil society that was organized by the Socialist Party of America. This is, of course, not a point that the liberals would make, but more a point with respect to the history of the left. But the 1920s is also a period when, especially as expressed in 1929, some of the ways in which the U.S. working class had sought aid and relief from especially urban ethnic associations, from kind of civil society groups, came under stress. And perhaps relatedly, this is, again, a very large point that we won't have time to fully delve into, that Marco is probably going to address. But the 1920s is also the period of the rise of the culture industry. So if you think about kind of the prospects for proletarian socialist organizing before the 20s, you have a greater pattern in working class life of reliance on voluntary civil social organizations for both material, economic, social, and cultural reproduction. Beginning in the 1920s, it's increasingly the culture industry that starts to play a role. The 1929 crisis throws many of the urban ethnic and other civil social relief agencies into crisis. And you also have an increasing turn in the 20s towards corporatism, towards workers seeking kind of welfare benefits from greater corporatist welfare contracts from their employers. And of course, this is also the ability of corporations to do this is also exacerbated by the crisis of 1929. So I think just thinking broadly about this period, it's a situation in which some of the, retrospectively, you could begin to trace some of the political, economic, social preconditions of the binding of the working class to the New Deal coalition that takes shape in the 1930s. Now, I mentioned this other figure writing in the avowed tradition of C. Wright Mills, the political sociologist William Domhoff. And he intervened in an academic debate that unfolded during the 1980s over the interpretation of the New Deal. And while this debate cannot be the focus of my talk here, it's worth briefly considering in relation to the political imagination prevalent among supporters of the Bernie Sanders campaign today. The debate seems to have given rise to three approaches, and this is my very rough reading of this. One which viewed the state as acting primarily in the interest of a uniform capitalist class, or in the interest of a particular sector or firm within that class. One which viewed the state as acting primarily in the interest of its own autonomous bureaucratic self-perpetuation and expansion. And one which viewed the state as acting in the interest of social movements, insofar as these movements exerted sufficient pressure on the state to wrest concessions from it. And in light of that, I want to just briefly reprise how Domhoff kind of cuts against these perspectives on the New Deal and on the state in characterizing the 1930s. Again, what is the history of the New Deal? What is the capitalist politics of the period? I think this at least begins to clarify it. He writes, Northern corporate moderates, representing some of the largest fortunes and biggest companies of that era, proposed all three of the major policy innovations that today define the New Deal: the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the National Labor Relations Act, and the Social Security Act, sometimes in reaction to pressures from the leaders of organized labor or disruptive efforts by grassroots leftist activists. Southern Democrats shaped these proposals to fit the needs of plantation capitalists and large agricultural interests throughout the country before they allowed any of them to pass. As for the ultra-conservatives in the corporate community, they uniformly opposed these New Deal initiatives, but they did not have any impact because there were so few conservative Republicans in Congress. In sum, corporate moderates proposed, corporate ultra-conservatives opposed, and Southern Democrats disposed in a context in which organized labor and the Communist Party were able to apply pressure through work stoppages, strikes, and demonstrations. In addition, urban liberals concerned with ameliorating the uncertainties of the marketplace and mitigating the worst effects of unfair business and labor practices for ordinary Americans had an impact on the NRA and SSA as members of the New Deal coalition and as allies of organized labor. My purpose in quoting Domhoff at length is not per se to take his part in this broader historiographical sociological debate, but to point to a political sobriety that I see there that is often absent on the contemporary left. Supporters of Medicare for All risk moving from a voluntarist enthusiasm in the context of the Sanders campaign, imagining that reform can be won if only a sufficiently militant movement for it is generated, to a determinist despair in the context of a Sanders defeat, imagining state corporate opposition to reform to be a permanent feature of American politics. Leaving aside the question of whether and how healthcare reform would expand the conditions of possibility for proletarian socialist politics, Domhoff reminds us that the realization of such reform would likely depend on the support and initiative of at least some sections of the capitalist class who may come to have their own interests in state-administered cost-cutting and regulation as they did during the 1930s. In the face of climate change, this point applies equally to the political prospects for a Green New Deal at both the national and the global scale. At present, there is little reason to predict the rebirth of the left in a manner equal even to the historic horizons of the Second International. As such, the prospects for Medicare for all and for a Green New Deal will remain a function of capitalist politics. I want to close by making a number of condensed points that we might further address during the Q&A. The first point, a widely acknowledged point, is that the avowed and actual purpose of the New Deal was to stabilize capitalism not only economically, but fundamentally politically, in the context of a global economic crisis that had given rise to Nazism and to the rise of fascism globally. The second point is that judged by the standard of rescuing capitalism from the Great Depression, the New Deal was not successful. But as a project of stabilizing capitalism politically, it was enormously successful, channeling sufficient degrees of material support to each of its major bases, the trusts, the urban political machines, the labor bureaucracy, and the Dixiecrats of the Jim Crow South, even if many more millions remained unemployed and unemployable in the face of these efforts. Trotsky captured this point in 1939 when he characterized the New Deal as a program of capitalist stabilization available only to very wealthy countries, such as the United States, the wealthy country of the era par excellence, whereas less wealthy countries tended more towards fascism, were unable to float the kind of New Deal expenditures that the U.S. state took on. A third point is that as the 1930s progressed, not only the Popular Front, but also the Rump Second International failed to escape the gravitational pull of the New Deal's model of integrating organized labor as a junior partner alongside the trusts and the state in capitalist political stabilization. By the late 1930s, Trotskyists could observe this not only in the United States, but also in Great Britain and France. Only the exiled Second International parties of Russia, Italy, and Germany, where they could not legally organize, adopted a more militant posture. Indeed, by the late 1940s, C. Wright Mills could characterize the American labor bureaucracy as the new men of power who had taken their place alongside the state and the corporations within the power elite. Even the Eisenhower-era Republican Party accepted labor's integration on these terms. A fourth point is that it was not the New Deal, but the War Deal that ended the Great Depression. As I indicated previously, the New Deal itself was modeled on the unprecedented state command of the American economy that the Progressives first administered during the First World War. As is familiar, this degree of state command grew to yet another unprecedented degree during the Second World War. While the command economy stabilized wartime conditions, it was the unprecedented destruction of the world's industrial capacity, major cities of the world, during the Second World War that left an equally unprecedented share of world GDP in the United States in 1945. I was trying to look this up before the talk, but I believe it was 50%, if I'm not mistaken, of the world's GDP was in the United States in 1945. The American economy boomed for decades under these conditions. A final point is, in this post-war context, the social democratic and even often the communist parties throughout the world continued to function according to this tripartite New Deal coalition model of capitalist governments shared between the capitalist trusts, the organized labor bureaucracy, and the military developmental state. It was on this political basis that the United States administered the post-war reconstruction of capitalist trading partner nations beyond the Iron Curtain and throughout the Third World, including in the occupied countries of Germany and Japan. Indeed, historians have claimed that the New Deal model was piloted in the United States during the 1930s, but actually achieved its widest reach and greatest successes in the global developmental statism of the post-war decades, even if this model ran up against certain limits and impasses by the 1960s. A final point, and again, I was relying on Marco a little bit here to address the Frankfurt School dimension of this, but a final point is that the distinctiveness of both Trotsky and the Frankfurt School as sources of intellectual perspective on this period rests in their ability to address the transformations of the capitalist state in a way that succumbs neither to progressivism nor to populism. In other words, to progressive liberalism or to populist liberalism. If Popular Front Stalinism's approach to the capitalist state effectively converges with progressive liberalism, we have to keep in mind that third period Stalinism's approach to the capitalist state bears considerable resemblance to a populist liberalism. Third period Stalinism characterized the New Deal as fascist, a 2018 book published by Monthly Review Press titled The Coming of the American Behemoth, The Origins of Fascism in the United States, 1920 to 1940, effectively reprises this third period Stalinist perspective on the New Deal. One finds in this book that same sense of helplessness and despair in the face of the political consolidation of capitalist statism that can be detected in the writings of Kolko and Rothbard. It's worth recalling that the populists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries sought to break up the trusts. They expressed the cry of the small farmer, of the small business owner, of the little man in the face of the rising regulatory state. Trotsky, however, opposed the politics that sought, as he put it in 1939, to bring back yesterday. The populist-inflected writings of Kolko and Rothbard, and perhaps even of Domhoff, reveal the continuity of counter-revolution from the progressive era through to the New Deal, and as an antidote, intellectually, to the progressive liberal and Stalinist historical imaginations predominant across the contemporary left, the perspective that these writings bring feels refreshing, critical, bracing. But if the perspectives of Trotsky and the Frankfurt School can be described as dialectical, it may be in part because they're able to simultaneously recognize the New Deal not only as counter-revolution, as the populists claim, but also as a revolutionary transformation of capitalism from which there is no going back. They recognize that any future proletarian socialist governing power would retrospectively view the unprecedented central political economic governance of global capitalism as an asset to be revolutionized, rather than as a purely reactionary behemoth to be broken up, as the petit bourgeois populist imagination would have it. The Trotskyist tradition may have failed to bequeath us with a viable political organizational model through which the left today could pursue that task, as my comments on the Socialist Party of America have implied. And the Frankfurt School, perhaps to their credit, held the conditions for organizing such a model to be unavailable by the 1930s in light of the death of the left. The historical horizon of leftist politics remains that which Lenin articulated and Debs also took up during the progressive era, to organize society and politics in order to move forward through the trusts and beyond them to socialism. So that is what I have. And now, let's have a bit of discussion.
Hey, so I had a number of thoughts. So I'm going to think through them as I'm saying them. First, I want to pick up on your last points by trying to address the question of politics and political ideology. So thinking about figures like Rothbard and Friedman, it seems like you were trying to graft them onto a kind of, how did you put it, populism versus progressivism.
Tending towards a populist liberalism.
Like libertarianism is a kind of populism.
Yeah.
From like, I think part of what mediates that 30s moment to the present moment is the 60s to 70s moment you brought up at the beginning of the talk, in which there was this kind of crisis of the New Deal coalition, and it was, we'll bring in new constituencies into the pluralist Democratic Party machines. So like instead of blacks, Jews, Catholics, and evangelical Christians, and the Southern Dixiecrats, it's now women, blacks, Latinos, gays, students, et cetera, et cetera. This is the more familiar McGovernism that we have, but this coincided with a kind of new political ideology from the right, and I think that the left at the time had a different calculation. So, recently Clint Montgomery, one of our members in Leipzig, did another teach-in on the New Deal, and he brought up he brought up how there was kind of a realignment strategy in the 60s from socialists like Max Shachtman, who was a former Trotskyist, who had this idea of trying to basically push the crisis of the Democratic Party over the cliff in order to make way for socialist party separate from the Democratic and Republican parties. So the idea was there could be a socialist party and a Democratic party as the two main competing parties in American politics. And that calculation turned out to be kind of misconceived. And that, they were thrown off by Nixon's election, for instance. That Nixon was able to respond to the new left better than the Democratic Party, which was the kind of the partner of the Communist Party from the 30s, better than they could really address. And they were also thrown off by the Reagan Revolution as well. And so I think, during the 60s and 50s and 40s, when like Rothbard and Friedman are kind of cutting their teeth, they were kind of treated as, or Hayek and Rothbard, later Friedman, they kind of just seemed like cranks, Yeah. And it wasn't politically viable in a sense, the discontent with the welfare state. And I think, it didn't seem like one could go back. And even when they did try to go back with the Reagan Revolution, with neoliberalism, we're looking at the kind of degrowth politics of the Democratic Party since the 70s that paved the way for that, on the basis of the ethnic identity and minority identity politics, like giving certain resources to survive degrowth in the 70s to those constituencies, providing like a basis for the later politics. It's kind of like a shift. It's a shift in capitalist politics. It's not really a turning back to the Belle Epoque, right?
Absolutely.
And but that reminds me of this last paragraph in Horkheimer's The Authoritarian State essay, which is an essay that we read in the Platypus reading group, where basically he's saying that for certain people on the left, it might seem at this time in the 1940s and 1950s that fascism and the New Deal, that the authoritarian state, the state capitalism, is actually somehow a step closer to socialism, and that those people would be neither the most ignorant nor the most stupid. At the same time, it would be possible to attempt to go back, but it would reproduce the problem over again. And so there's kind of like they held open the possibility that there was a return, and in a certain sense that allowed them to stay clear of a lot of illusions, and to really keep open about that question of ideology and politics, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it's almost like they're articulating this possibility of like, what if there exist populist leaning rather than progressivist leaning political forces that through which it might be possible to kind of have a redo, in the sense that it's not clear during the Second World War and after that this coalition will simply be the reigning coalition, the dominant coalition. Things are up in the air after the Second World War. So when you say that, it just points to, it makes me think that they're thinking about whether and how there could be conditions of possibility for organizing populist discontent with the New Deal coalition, that even if those would effectively repose the problem, it would still do so under political conditions that might turn out otherwise than the arc of the progressive era did with the rise and death of the left. That's putting it very broadly, but is that sort of what you're getting at?
Yeah, and perhaps even the way I would put it is like, rather than populist, like petty bourgeois democratic.
Yeah.
More broadly. And
right.
And this is an interesting thing that I was thinking about with respect to Clint's teaching and your teaching as well, which is that the term progressivism kind of vexes us. So like in the reading group, we've been thinking through revisionism and thinking how the revolutionary Marxists that we're looking at in the reading group are thinking through that as like a return to the moment of like a regression back to the 1848 moment. And so like they talk about like the two lines of the revolution, like the petty bourgeois democratic line, which seems to be ascending, and the proletarian line, which is descending, like a regressive line. And they also talk about, like the simultaneous like anarchism and liberalism of Bernstein, or the economists in Russia. So like they have this anarchistic bent in the sense that they are avoiding the political struggle, and they think that the advancement and socialization of production and the growth of the trade unions will itself kind of ameliorate the conditions. And
economism, which is also effectively progressivism at this time, and relatedly an intellectual perspective of like class. As it would now appear. Yes.
And the flip side of that perspective is then they thought that you would need you needed a parliamentary wing of the party to represent the trade unions in petty bourgeois democracy. Yeah. And so the terms that they were thinking about was in terms of petty bourgeois democracy versus proletarian socialism. It's just something I'm thinking about. Like that seems to be the progressivism kind of throws us for a loop, I feel.
Yes.
Because it's difficult to place within that framework where Marxism could kind of have this internal critique of itself sui generis. You know what I'm saying? Whereas progressivism seems to be like an alternative question mark, you know?
Yeah, right. I guess I was sort of treating it, and this might be fudging things a bit, but I was sort of treating revisionism as progressivism, effectively, as like progressivism under the flag of avowed Marxism. That's effectively what it represents. That as the party is organizing more of society, and these progressivist drives are coming out of society and interfacing with politics. That effectively, as a function of the party's success in organizing a wider swath of society, especially as in Germany, but also as in Russia, it's giving rise to progressivism within itself. And that's why I think Lenin's writings are very clear on this point, that there's a convergence internationally between the progressives and the revisionists during this period. There's actually also a progressive academic history called Uncertain Victory, which basically makes the same point, albeit obviously from an anti-Leninist point of view, but sort of talking about how there's this kind of commonsensical, global realization of the necessity and desirability of progressivist politics during this period. I've often found it helpful to think of progressivism fundamentally as that politics which prepares society and politics for the upcoming regime of capital accumulation. I think if you put it in those very kind of conceptual terms, it can then also describe the way in which the neoliberal McGovernite coalition appears to us as progressive. What does it mean to be a progressive today? It means you're a McGovernite liberal Democrat. Why is that? Does it just mean something else that has nothing to do with trusts? or seemingly little to do with trust. But I think one way that you can think about it is that was kind of the ideology and the organizational model through which the state was able to administer society and politics during the neoliberal era.
I don't want to hog the mic, but...
So I had two questions. One related to, you intimated a little bit of what Marco was going to talk about, and then one more directed to what you were talking about. The first is just a clarification question. I came in a little bit late. If you could clarify what you mean by the Stalinization of the New Deal. Only because for me, already Stalinism itself, I missed the reading group this past summer, so I'm always a little unsure about what it means. And
I did too, so we'll try.
Yeah, and so understanding, at least prima facie, it's hard for me to understand how, the U.S. government is affected by Stalinism in a certain sense. So clarification there would be helpful. And then the other one Sorry, I probably have coronavirus. No,
let's get it over with.
My other question is about I've been going to a lot of my friends at UChicago. They are involved in UChicago for Bernie, and so I have been entertaining many debates, and for whatever reason, it always seems to come back to the New Deal or the New Deal. And so a very basic question that I had is I've read some, I don't know these people you mentioned, so I'm curious to read them. I've read like Ira Katz-Nelson, who you mentioned when affirmative action was white. And so I know some of like, in the past, the Faustian bargains that the New Deal has to entertain, etc. But whenever I like rehearse this with some people at these debates, it'll be like, okay, well, you know, this was back when the South was controlled by Dixiecrats. This is back.
Yes.
And so like, they'll say, okay, and you know what? Yeah, that sucks. That's terrible. That's created these terrible racial things. But that's not what the New Deal's asking for. And so like, maybe just a very basic level to open the question up. How does this history color our view of what a New Deal would be like, and where it would possibly fail, or where we might be critical of it?
Yeah. Let me start with that. I think it's too bad. I think you did miss. I'm glad I addressed this the way that I did early in my talk, because I suspected that indeed people on the left today are thinking and talking this way, and it seems from what you're saying that this is true. You know, the way I put it here is that it's like people want a neoliberal redux of the paleoliberal New Deal. Mm-hmm. Like let's do the New Deal again, but this time it won't be exclusionary or discriminatory in any way. Mm-hmm. It'll be like a McGovernite New Deal. Mm-hmm. I think what I tried to point to in evoking William Domhoff, and again, you know, without wanting to sort of fixate on his perspective in particular, is just, again, the need to consider the way in which there are capitalist class interests in regulation. There are capitalist class interests in reform. And I think it's important to maintain a political sobriety about this. Actually, the very reforms that one may wish for and desire may prove to be in the interest of sections of the capitalist class who will organize and for them. That is effectively the history of the progressive era and of the New Deal. So then the question is how the left relates to it. One great anecdote in Kolko is that he talks about, I believe it was in 1906, some kind of federal meat inspection reform act, and he talks about how Upton Sinclair was a Socialist Party of America member at this time, right? And maybe the potted history of this that we have in our minds is that Sinclair, the socialist muckraker, writes his book, and then this prompts reform, right? There's a kind of public outcry, and about how bad the meat is, and then therefore there's a reform. But what Kolko articulates actually is that there was already a large interest on the part of the meat trust for reform, in part because they were trying to export these meat products to Europe, and the Europeans weren't buying contaminated meat. Now, I think the point is that actually Sinclair had no illusions about this. He wasn't trying to, he wasn't undertaking a crusade from below to pressure the capitalist state for reform. He was actually trying to popularize the conditions of the workers, not the bad meat. And the vast majority of the reform effort and political will behind federal meat inspection came from the trusts themselves. And so again, the left at that time, Sinclair as a Second International Socialist, had no illusions about this, right? Fast forward to the 1930s, and I think there's a similar logic that you can see, and Domhoff goes into this in great detail, but even with respect to organized labor, which is perhaps maybe the most celebrated and remembered dimension of New Deal policy and politics in the 1930s, in many ways it was the actions of the federal government that prompted the organizing drive, and not the other way around. And I think part of this, I don't really have the ability to address this in detail. But I think part of the story here is that a lot of the largest capitalist firms in the context of the Depression and cutthroat competition from small upstarts who could potentially undercut prices by structuring their shops to have very bad conditions and very low wages. Part of the point of industrial unionism, from the perspective of the trust and the largest capitalists, was to raise the overhead of raise the wage bill across a sector, so that it made it more difficult for an upstart competitor to break in, right? So actually a lot of the largest firms encouraged unionization. They said, okay, unionize our shop and then go unionize those 5, which are smaller. We're going to be able to take the costs, but 3 of them won't, and then we're going to have a better situation in the market. That's probably not the only factor to mention in this history, but I think this approach to the actually pattern of sections of the capitalist class having an interest in reform is one that I think the contemporary left would benefit from taking on board intellectually and historically. It could be that there will be, from sections of the healthcare industry. I know some of our members know much more about this than I do. It could be that there will be, support from sections of the healthcare industry for some kind of healthcare reform, for Medicare for all. I think my sense of this is that maybe a difference between Trump and a lot of Sanders supporters is that Trump begins from this premise. He has few illusions about what he's doing. He's sort of organizing some section of the capitalist class to push through certain reforms in certain areas that may be opposed by other sections. And I think, again, as I mentioned, I think I do see, just thinking of some personal friends, among Sanders supporters today, a kind of militant voluntarism that somehow we could have anything we want if only we build, a reform movement strong enough. Well, if you have a near majority socialist party organizing the vast majority of, American society and politics, you could talk about that. If you have something even approaching that, you could talk about that. But under today's conditions, there is no left. And so, really these kinds of reform movements will, for better or worse, I think just as a matter of a fact of political sociology, they will require the backing of sections of capitalists. I don't know if that kind of addresses what you were talking about. Stalinization is a huge question. My sense from conversations with Marco about this is that effectively what happens under conditions of sort of punishing austerity in the 1920s Soviet Union is that there's a rising class of young people that are interested in moving forward in society. And effectively the only way for them to do so, because of the sort of retrograde political condition of a one-party state that also has full control over each and every civil society organization, is to become members of the party. So effectively what you have is people pursuing their discontents and aspirations in and through the party in a manner that cannot be politically differentiated from official revolutionary Marxism. And I think in a way that Trotsky studies in much greater detail, this results in a kind of bureaucratization into the rise of a bureaucratic class or caste. And this colors certainly the politics in the Soviet Union. Now that phenomena is recognized or perhaps misrecognized by figures in the 1930s, like Daniel Burnham, who breaks from Trotskyism to eventually a conservative point of view, as a kind of bureaucratic revolution that is basically convergent with similar tendencies in the United States New Deal and in fascism. And I kind of want to hold that to one side. But that's maybe one way that this gets recognized at the time. But I suppose the more direct answer is that of, that you can get also from anti-communist historians like Harvey Clare, is that the Comintern comes to direct the politics of communist parties in every country in the world. And, I mentioned a little bit what this meant to Debs. Debs thought that they simply did not understand the American situation. I think he had a perspective that was more similar to Rosa Luxemburg's on the founding of the Third International. But when Stalin declares socialism in one country, effectively the Third International serves as a kind of outlet for the state interest of the USSR. And so communist parties across the world are treated as sort of pressure valves that can be turned up or down depending on the way in which the Soviet state wishes to pressure or negotiate with the capitalist state governments. And so this can mean at times, if the negotiation isn't going well, you call FDR a fascist, and you have third period Stalinism, right? You have the organized communist parties doing their utmost to oppose the liberal capitalist coalition. If better terms can be struck, you have the Popular Front. And so there are a lot of zigs and zags throughout the 30s that arguably are expressive of the kind of state interests of the Soviet Union. Of course, once the Hitler-Stalin Pact is signed, the Soviet Union, the Comintern, the Third International, and therefore the Communist Party USA, kind of return to this third period approach, like after the Popular Front, of effectively characterizing FDR as a fascist. Again, this American behemoth imagination of the New Deal. And then, of course, the Soviets joined the Allied war effort, and again, that's reversed. So more could be said about that, but that really, those are effectively the two, intellectually and politically speaking, those are sort of the two modes of the Stalinist zigzags throughout the 30s. The kind of effective liquidation into a progressivist liberalism. And I would say, again, I'm being a little bit gestural here, but you could call the third period a bit of a liquidation into a populist liberal perspective. Neither, I would say, really approximates the historic perspective of the radicalism of the Second International.
Can I add on to that? I wanted to relate to an earlier point in your talk, standing in for Marco here for a second, but something that you raised was Wilson, like the continuation between Wilson's and FDR. But one of the ways that this appears is that in 1917 to 1919, there seems to be two opposing global reorderings in response to the revolutionary crisis of the early 20th century. On one hand, you have Wilson's League of Nations. On the other hand, you have Lenin's Third International, right? So in a sense, like what you're describing is the way in which the Communist Party kind of liquidated itself into the nation-state model on a national level in terms of vying for positions and within the national petty bourgeois democracy, but also like in terms of the international network of nation-states as defined by the kind of Wilsonian system. But I just wanted to...
Absolutely, yes.
Small historical question, and maybe you answered it before I got here, but how do we account for just this complete liquidation of populism within the Democratic Party, this sudden shift under Wilson, or maybe it wasn't so sudden? And what happened to all of this populism? Like, it looks like it was just completely excluded through the rest of the 20th century, or at least until a sort of much later, with eventually the New Deal coalition. I'm mostly just interested in this sudden reversal in the Democratic Party and what motivates it. How did that play out?
Yeah, well, two thoughts come to mind. I guess at a very abstract level, populism always declines. Populism is decline. It's sort of the political expression of declining classes and forces. Capitalism is always changing, right? Every few decades, there's a profound reorganization of capitalist politics and society. And classes which were able to sustain and expand themselves in their roles in one era will find themselves, adapted to that era alone and thrown off in the context of the new era. So, perhaps you could say it's the fate of the populism of every era to decline. Certainly, prospects for small farmers don't come back, right, after the 1890s. Again, C. Wright Mills, actually, his book, I think it might be in White Collar, he talks about this, right, that the pattern of American life, of a kind of agrarian small-town pattern, fundamentally vanishes between the late 19th century and the middle of the 20th century. So that would be one way of expressing it. But the other thing to think about is that one way in which the Socialist Party of America was actually a little bit closer to populism, I guess you could say, in a way that becomes politically significant, is that contra the progressives, they steadfastly opposed the intervention of the state into private life to address social ills. So the progressivists, right, are the great prohibitionists. And the populists during this period, and kind of a populist commitment within the Democratic Party, is to a wet politics. Of course, this is especially predominant in like urban ethnic constituencies that have these traditional drinking patterns. So is that populist in character? I think really during this period it's the agrarianism that has more of the politics of populism tied to it. But there's also this laissez-faire attitude towards private life that I think the populists seem to have, and that the socialists also agree with, but they take the step of also saying, let's organize civil society and social life to address ills. We're not going to call the state in to sort of punish them, to criminalize ways in which people are reproducing themselves in capitalism, but we will try to organize them towards enlightenment and empowerment away from kind of degradation that can happen in urban life. And I think the populists had a more kind of laissez-faire approach of just hands off. So I do think that might be one way you can see the revival of it. But also, I wonder if it would be, I think historians have addressed the KKK, which has a kind of revival in the 1920s from the perspective of populism as well. But yeah, it's a good question. My sense is that fundamentally the fate of populist politics during this period was tied to agrarian discontents, though, in short.
So they were just subordinated completely to the new Democratic Party leadership, or were they just expelled?
That's a good question. I think I think that when William Jennings Bryan enters the Democratic Party, it expresses the fundamental failure of the populist movement of the 1890s. I think the 1890s is really the moment of American populism. And interestingly, Eugene Debs is a supporter of William Jennings Bryan in 1896. So he moves from that politics into the Socialist Party politics. And I know that certain remnants, probably the most radical remnants of the populist movement of the 1890s and the most politically intractable vis-a-vis capitalist politics, actually follow Debs into the Socialist Party. And that can pose some problems for the party in the 1900s. They have sections in the U.S. South which are racist. They have like racist locals of the Socialist Party. I'm not sure the degree to which those locals are coming out of populism, but I think there is some overlap there. So populism after 1900 is sort of in play. It's up for grabs, and some of it's being captured by the Socialist Party, and some of it's being captured by the Democratic Party. I think that at this point, the Republican Party is not in any way meaningfully competing for its support.
So the shift in Democratic leadership was a lot more gradual than I had posited, not just a sudden reversal with Wilson, or. In the sense of Wilson as opening the way for progressivism in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think Wilson, though, does represent a kind of shift in the Democratic Party away from a commitment to populism and towards a progressivist politics.
But it wasn't coming out of nowhere.
What was that?
But it wasn't coming out of nowhere. It's not like we have a sudden sort of coup taking place in the Democratic Party leadership that just shifts it from populism to progressivism. There are more forces at play there than I had previously posited.
Yeah, and my sense of this history, I'm not an expert on it, but my sense of this history is that a lot of the progressive forces are these intellectuals, these middle-class reformers, and they're committed to capitalist party politics, but they're not sort of Republican diehards. And so when TR sees when Teddy Roosevelt sees the kind of ineffectual nature of Taft in leading a kind of progressive coalition vis-a-vis the trusts and the kind of reform and regulatory needs of the trusts, he launches this third party campaign. It fails, and the progressives are a bit adrift, and Wilson is open to integrating them into the Democratic Party coalition. And again, they're not sort of adamantly against that. I know it's during this period, and I recall this from the Ken Burns documentary, that FDR actually runs, I think for the first time, as a Democrat in New York, and he asks TR for his blessing, like, is it all right that I'm crossing party lines? And TR basically says, well, you can fight the bosses. I think, in other words, like the urban patronage machine bosses in either party. This is the fight of progressivism, to fight the bosses in either party. So you can do it in the Democratic Party. They're open to either party during this period.
I was hoping you could speak a little bit about, you're talking about the New Deal as a sort of preservative or like a preservation tactic for capital. And I'm thinking of the Green New Deal as a similar approach to the economic or to the ecological disaster, and and as a way to like sustain capital. And I was wondering if you could maybe highlight where there are sorts of historical differences, distances between those two things, just briefly.
Well, I actually see a lot of similarities between them at the level of what could be possible in the future. But at present, it doesn't seem that there's, I'm not kind of the most close and careful follower of alignments in capitalist class politics. But my sense right now is that there is not a large and prevailing capitalist class interest in something like a Green New Deal, but there could be. There very easily could be. And it'll be certainly something that's negotiated, my guess is, at the global level, that may involve, for example, negotiations between the United States and China with respect to limiting Chinese emissions. My sense is that any national section of firms may be weary to undertake undue expenses unless and until there are kind of similar efforts and belt tightenings undertaken in other countries. I think my main point was simply to say that it'll be a function of that. I'm not an expert on that, but I think that's the level at which sort of that's the political level at which these questions will be mediated going forward.
Anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, well, like following up on that, I think that following up on that, and also a point that you made, which was that Trump is kind of more sober than the progressives. And at one point you suggested that progressivism is kind of preparing for the next phase of capital accumulation.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it is now. Meaning I don't think that
sure.
we can be expecting like a phase of progressive capitalism because I think Trump is so effective, and you know, like I just one example of what you were talking about, which is organizing kind of the capitalist class to push through some reforms. I think like something that has been unexpected for people is in 2018, the First Step Act, Trump's
yes, right,
criminal justice reform.
Progressive,
arguably progressive traditionally maybe, but like you know, and I think there is a constituency of people like who have politics sympathetic to that, or have like, so in the west side of Chicago and the south side of Chicago, a lot of people voted for Willie Wilson in the election in 2019, who supported Trump in the 2016 election. And he took a lot of flack for that and kind of like wavered on it, but he portrayed himself as a Trumpian and continued to do so regardless. And so I you know, it's an interesting kind of dynamic where like people are surprised that Trump actually has like, or another example like is the you know, Trump having 20% of the Latino vote in 2016, or 12% of the African American vote, and so he's like, it seems like he's making gains with constituencies which are traditionally bound up with this progressive New Deal coalition and its kind of 60s to 70s McGovern formulation.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could kind of comment on that and
yes,
relate it to Grant's question about like the, you know, if there's gonna be an answer to kind of this ecological discontent, it's gonna be through kind of, if Trump is reelected, it will be answered through kind of Trumpism, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So a few thoughts. I think actually in Platypus generally, there's some good discussion right now. At the risk of sort of sounding crude, like what do words mean? You know, what does socialism mean? What does progressivism mean? Do they mean the meaning that people impute to them, or do they have some kind of inherent logical historical coordinate? It's worth pointing out, if I'm not mistaken, there's a book called The Failure of Independent Liberalism. And if I'm not mistaken, it traces the life and thought of some dissident intellectuals during this early 20th century period who support progressive era reforms but oppose the New Deal. So I've emphasized the opposite because I think that's a meaningful through line. But I think it's worth asking then, are such people not progressives? In other words, they support the demands, the kind of political, social demands of reforming capitalism to accommodate the imperatives of accumulation in one era, but then 20 years later, they are no longer on board. Do they cease being progressives? You know, is progressivism defined, you know, as the commitments that are articulated in the progressive era? I would argue that that almost shades into a kind of sub-progressivism. In other words, I would argue that actually it's useful to think of the New Dealers as the progressives of their era. It's useful to think of the social movementists and the McGovernites as the progressives of their era. And in another way, I think it's useful to think of Trump as a kind of progressive today, vis-a-vis the tasks of the coming phase of capital accumulation. I've often thought that, you know, with respect to his work re-engineering and restructuring global trade, he kind of reflects at a kind of global political economic level what someone in the Democratic Party like Tulsi Gabbard, you know, expresses at the level of foreign policy, right? I think both figures, you know, can appear to be progressive insofar as they mark a shift away from some of the commitments of the previous era, and arguably may help to restructure capitalist politics in a way more conducive to accumulation in the coming era. But if progressivism is defined as Sandersism, I would agree with you. right? Like its discontents are bound up with those of the economic crisis, with austerity, and its political imagination is fundamentally shaped by, the new left and by effectively the 1980s left, as Chris Cutrone has written about. So those are sort of the previous era's progressives. Does that help to clarify or address? Yeah.
So if no one has any more questions, maybe we'll wrap up. And thanks, Ed, for speaking. And thank you all for coming. This will be online soon. It's been recorded, so you'll be able to access it. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for a good discussion.